The iron gates didn't creak when I pushed them open. They groaned, a low, metallic rasp that felt less like a lack of oil and more like a warning. My name is Julian Vane, and I had just become the sole owner of Blackwood Manor. My grandfather, Arthur, had been a man of precision and profound silence. When he died, he left me the house with a single, handwritten note tucked into the deed. The weight of the house is not in its stone, but in what it holds. Do not go into the attic after the sun sets. Better yet, do not go in at all. I laughed it off at the time. To a city dweller like me, old houses were just puzzles of plumbing and dry rot. Blackwood was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian monstrosity perched on a jagged hill in the Pacific Northwest. It was surrounded by pines so thick they seemed to swallow the light, even at noon. The first few days were spent airing out the stagnant scent of mothballs and old paper. The house was a labyrinth of velvet curtains and heavy oak furniture. But no matter which room I was in, I felt a peculiar sensation. It wasn't the feeling of being watched, not exactly. It was the feeling of being measured. On the 4th night, the sounds began. I was lying in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor when I heard a rhythmic thump drag coming from directly above me. The attic. It wasn't the scurrying of rats or the settling of floorboards. It was heavy, deliberate. Thump, drag, thump, drag. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in the shape of a jagged lightning bolt. As I watched, a tiny puff of dust drifted down from the crack, settling on my duvet. Something up there was moving right over my head. Grandfather was a paranoid old man. I whispered to the empty room, though my voice lacked conviction. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and walked into the hallway. The air was colder here, smelling of wet earth and copper. At the end of the hall was the narrow, inconspicuous door leading to the attic stairs. It was locked with 3 different deadbolts, all of which were on the outside. My hand trembled as I reached for the first bolt. Thump, drag. The sound stopped the moment my fingers touched the metal. I froze. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was a hungry silence, a vacuum that seemed to suck the breath out of my lungs. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for a growl, a scratch, anything. Instead, I heard a voice. It wasn't a scream or a ghostly moan. It was a soft, wet clicking sound, like someone tapping a fingernail against a glass eye. And then, a whisper that didn't come from the door, but from the vents in the floor. Julian, you have your mother's eyes. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered on the hardwood, the beam dancing wildly across the wallpaper. I didn't open the door. I ran. I retreated to my room, locked the door, and pushed a heavy dresser in front of it. I stayed awake until the sun bled through the pines, but the scratching didn't return. It didn't have to. It knew I was listening. The next morning, the house felt different. The sunlight seemed thinner, unable to penetrate the corners of the rooms. I told myself I had imagined the voice. Sleep deprivation and the isolation of the woods can play tricks on a man's mind. But then I found the photographs. In the study, tucked behind a collection of leather-bound journals, was a silver locket. Inside was a picture of my mother as a child. She was sitting in the garden, smiling. But in the background, in the 3rd-story window of the attic, there was a shape. I took a magnifying glass to the image. It wasn't a reflection of the trees. It was a face, or the suggestion of one. It was pale, elongated, with eyes that were too large and spaced too far apart. It wasn't looking at the camera. It was looking at her. I began to read my grandfather's journals. His handwriting, usually so neat, devolved into a frantic scrawl in the final months. October 14th. It asked for more today. It's not enough to watch. It wants to participate. I told it the bloodline ends with me. I lied. November 2nd. I can hear it mimicking the tea kettle again. It's getting better at the human sounds. It calls itself the tenant. It says it was here before the foundation was poured. It says we are its clothes. My blood ran cold. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't been living in this house. He had been guarding it. Or perhaps he was the warden of a prison that he was also an inmate of. That night, the retention loop of fear tightened. I didn't go to bed. I sat in the kitchen with a butcher knife and a pot of black coffee. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the clicking started again. But this time, it wasn't in the attic. It was in the walls of the kitchen. Click, click, click. I watched as the wallpaper began to bulge. Something was moving behind the lath and plaster, something long and multi-jointed. It moved with a fluid, sickening grace. I followed the movement with my eyes as it traveled up the wall, across the ceiling, and toward the light fixture. The bulb began to flicker. In the strobe-like light, I saw a hand, if you could call it that. It was gray, translucent, with fingers that had far too many knuckles. It reached out from the gap in the crown molding and began to unscrew the bulb. "What do you want?" I screamed, swinging the knife at the air. The bulb fell and shattered. Total darkness swallowed the kitchen. "I want to see what you're made of, Julian," the voice whispered. It was closer now, right behind my ear. It sounded like my own voice, but distorted, as if played through a broken speaker. Arthur was dry, brittle, but you are full of life, full of memories. I felt a cold, damp pressure on my shoulder. I lunged forward, stumbling out of the kitchen and into the foyer. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the gravel driveway in my pajamas. The night air was biting, but I didn't care. I looked up at the attic window. The pale face was there. It pressed against the glass, its features blurring and shifting. As I watched, its face began to change. It smoothed out, the eyes shrinking, the hair growing. It was becoming me. I spent the rest of the night in my car, the engine running, the doors locked. I planned to leave at first light, to drive until I hit the coast and never look back. But when morning came, the car wouldn't start. The hood was open. The spark plug wires had been meticulously stripped, not bitten or torn, but peeled like fruit. I was trapped. The realization of my predicament brought a strange, numb clarity. I couldn't leave. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away through dense, trackless forest. The house was an island, and the sea was made of shadows. I decided that if I was going to die, I wouldn't do it cowering in a car. I went back inside. The house was silent. The tenant was no longer hiding in the walls. I could feel it back in the attic, waiting. I climbed the stairs, my feet heavy. I reached the attic door. The deadbolts were still thrown. I didn't need a key. The door simply drifted open. The attic was a graveyard of memories. Old trunks, broken mannequins, and stacks of paintings covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the room sat a single high-backed chair, facing away from me. "I'm here," I said, my voice cracking. The chair slowly rotated. It wasn't a monster sitting there. It was a man. He wore my grandfather's old suit. He had my face, the same jawline, the same birthmark on the neck. But the eyes were wrong. They were like mirrors, reflecting nothing but the darkness of the room. "You're late for dinner, Julian," the thing said. Its voice was now a perfect replica of mine. "You're the thing from the attic," I whispered. "What did you do to my grandfather?" The creature smiled, and its mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth. "I didn't do anything to Arthur. Arthur is here. He's just integrated." The creature stood up. Its movements were jerky, as if it were a puppeteer learning to use a new set of strings. It walked toward a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. "We are an old species, Julian," it said, caressing the glass. "We don't have shapes of our own. We borrow them. We find a family, a bloodline, and we move in. We watch. We learn the nuances of your grief, the architecture of your fears. And when the host is spent, we move to the next." It gestured to the floor. For the first time, I noticed the patterns in the dust. They weren't footprints. They were symbols, ancient and geometric, etched into the wood. "Why the attic?" I asked, trying to keep it talking as I reached into my pocket for the lighter I'd found in the kitchen. "Perspective," the thing replied. "From the top, you can see the whole life. You can see the patterns of the prey below. You see, Julian, your grandfather didn't keep me here to protect the world. He kept me here because he was lonely. He traded his identity for a legacy that would never die. The creature lunged. It didn't use claws. It used its weight, slamming into me and pinning me to the floor. The skin felt like cold wax. I struggled, the lighter flickering in my hand. Now, it hissed, its face inches from mine, its features beginning to melt and run like a candle. Give me your eyes. I didn't scream. I jammed the lighter into the stack of oil paintings beside us. The dry canvas ignited instantly. A roar of orange flame surged toward the rafters. The creature shrieked, a sound of tearing metal. It recoiled, the fire reflecting in its mirror eyes. It hated the light. It hated the chaos. I scrambled toward the stairs as the attic became an oven. I didn't look back. I flew down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the front doors just as the windows of the third floor exploded outward in a shower of glass and sparks. I ran until my lungs burned, collapsing on the edge of the road as the sun began to rise. I watched from the safety of the pines as Blackwood Manor burned to the ground. The smoke was black and oily, rising high into the clear blue sky. It was over. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a small motel room in a town 3 states away. I had lost everything, but I was alive. I looked in the bathroom mirror to shave. I ran the razor over my jaw, watching the foam fall away. I felt a slight itch on my shoulder. I turned to look. There, in the center of my shoulder blade, was a small, gray patch of skin. It was translucent with the faint texture of wax. I touched it and it didn't feel like skin. It felt like something borrowed. I looked back into the mirror. My eyes were still mine. But then I leaned closer. Deep within my pupils, past the iris, I saw a tiny, flickering orange light. It wasn't a reflection of the room. It was the memory of a fire. And then I heard it. Not in the room. Not in the walls. Click, click, click. The sound was coming from inside my own skull. The house hadn't been the prison. The bloodline was. And as I watched, my reflection smiled at me. A smile that was just a fraction of a second too late. The tenant hadn't burned. It had just moved to a new floor. If you love this story and want more contents like this, comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out the channel for interesting videos.